Before there was a map of Australia, there was already a nightmare. Centuries before any European boot touched that soil, the continent had already been imagined as a grotesque space, a land peopled by monsters. Its very existence was considered heretical by some. And when the British Empire finally decided to do with it, what did they do? They made it a prison. Hello and welcome back to Holes in the Forest, the place where the folk tales they forgot to tell you come out to dance. I'm Marianne Saltores, folklorist, Gothic scholar, published author, and book publisher over at Kaipora Books. And I am absolutely delighted to be here with you today, talking about all the eerie things we love. Now, this episode exists because of you. Specifically, because of a follower from Australia who asked, is there anything like tropical Gothic in Australia? Well, oh, yes. Yes, there is. And is extraordinary. Let's start at the beginning, which is appropriately before the beginning. The antipodes, that's what they called the idea of Australia long before anyone confirmed it existed. And the antipodes wasn't just a geographical concept, it was a moral one. It was the place that was upside down, the dark mirror, the underside of the world. Do you remember that line in Alice in Wonderland when she says she would fall all the way down to Australia? Yeah. When the British Empire decided to use it as a prison colony to ship its criminals to the bottom of the earth, it seemed to confirm what people already believed, that this was a place of punishment, of exile, of darkness. One scholar put it perfectly. Australia was, for all intents and purposes, the dungeon of the world. And dungeons, as we know, are very Gothic. Now, here is where it gets truly fascinating, and where the Gothic stops being just a metaphor and becomes something structural. Think about what Gothic fiction is at its core. It's about the uncanny, that Freudian idea that something is deeply, wrongly familiar. The home that feels like isn't ours, the space that looks right but feels wrong. The sensation that the ground beneath you might not be solid. For European settlers arriving in Australia, this wasn't literary advice. It was Tuesday. Their trees shed their bark the wrong way around. Their swans were black. The seasons were reversed. The animals looked like something a fever dream stitched together. Everything they knew about nature, about how the world worked, was quietly, persistently wrong. And for people already carrying psychological weight of exile, of convictism, of being sent to the edge of the known world, that wrongness didn't just disturb them, it haunted them. The familiar had become unheimlich, unhomely, and the Gothic was the only literary form that could hold that feeling.
here's where the early critics threw up their hands. Because the Gothic, as a European tradition, relied on antiquity, old castles, crumbly abbeys, the weight of centuries pressing down on buildings. And its stones, Mrs. Radcliffe needed Italy. Walpole needed his castle, and he's too big of a statue. I never really got that one. The whole apparatus dependent on accumulated history, on ruins that whisper. We do love that too. But Australia, from a colonial perspective, had none of that. Ding, 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 just like the tropical Gothic from South America. A critic named Frederick Sinnott said it bluntly in 1956. He wrote that Australian authors couldn't extract the heroes through the secret panels and underground passages because there were no ruins old enough to tempt even the most desperate ghost. What a jerk. Here's what's in it missed. Australia didn't need old ruins. It had something far more powerful. A living wound. European Gothic could project its darkness elsewhere, onto foreign villains, onto ancient crimes, onto safely distant past. A huge statue. I do love the Castle of Otranto, but I have to point out that statue. Moving on. Australian Gothic couldn't. The horror was recent. The horror was here. The horror was everyone's grandfather. Writers like Marcus Clarke understood this visually. In his landmark work, his Natural Life, serialized in 1870, Clarke dove into the documented reality of the convict system. The cannibalism, the betrayal, the suffering. He wasn't sensationalizing for entertainment. He was saying, this happened here on this ground, and it matters. For him, the Gothic wasn't escapism. It was the only honest way to give Australia a history. And that's the thing about Australian Gothic that makes it so uncomfortable even now, unlike Walpole and his statue. Okay, I'll stop. Who could invoke antiquity, unlike Radcliffe, who could set her villains in Italy, mostly. The darkness of Australian Gothic implicated the living. It did so with Miss Radcliffe as well. But, there's a difference. People didn't want to look. Many believed this stain of convictism should be quietly forgotten. Under the carpet, humans do love that. But Gothic fiction, by its very nature, refuses to let the dead stay buried. And then there's the land itself. Because if the convict system gave Australian Gothic its historical horror, the landscape gave it its elemental one. You know how people say anything in Australia can kill you? that. Barbara Baynton. Remember this name. 1902 collection Bush Studies is one of the most quietly terrifying things I have ever read. She wrote about women alone in the outback, surrounded by arid, indifferent land, menaced by dangerous men, abandoned by husbands, utterly alone. Gothic is not haunted houses. It is not ancestral curses. I'm not going to talk about the statue. It is a woman alone, and the sound of boots on dry earth coming closer. Every woman knows how that must feel like. It is intensely real. And that is precisely what makes it Gothic. Henry Lawson worked in a similar register. His story, The Bush Undertaker, ends with these words, and I want you to feel them. The sun sank again on the grand Australian bush. The nurse and tutor of eccentric minds, the home of the weird and of much that is different from things in other lands. The home of the weird, written in 1892, Australian Gothic was already naming itself. The Gothic, as it was used by European settlers, didn't just articulate their fears, it also became a tool of dehumanization. Aboriginal people were cast as the monsters, as the Gothic threat, as the specters haunting the land that settlers wanted to claim. We've covered that on Tropical Gothic. Rural people being the problem, the sickness, the thing holding back progress, as Europeans saw. There's a legal doctrine called terra nullius, the obscene colonial fiction that Australia was a land owned by no one, which was only overturned in 1993. For centuries, the Gothic served that lie. It made the original inhabitants of the continent into the horror story, so that their dispossession could feel like civilization. That happened to indigenous people everywhere. Can you see a pattern here? I can. But something extraordinary happened. Aboriginal writers and artists began to turn the Gothic language around. The writer Mudruru. Can someone please tell me how this is supposed to be pronounced correctly? Because I do not speak all the languages in the world, and I can't speak that. So please, let me know in the comments how to say it right. But he, Australia's most prolific Aboriginal writer, at the time did something brilliant. In his novel, Dr. Woolreddy's Prescription for Enduring the End of the World, he got thick-beside the invasion he called the British Nun, which literally means ghosts. Did I pronounced that correctly. No? No? No?
The ghosts haunting Aboriginal land. Yes, sir. The monsters rewritten. The haunting reversed. And filmmaker Tracy Moffat did the same in her films, using Gothic imagery not to frighten but to indict, to make visible the true horror. White social policy, assimilation, the machinery of erasure. That is what Gothic can do, and it's at its most powerful. It doesn't just scare you, it shows you who built the dungeon and who was locked inside. Australian Gothic didn't stop in the 19th century, it grew. And it kept changing. Patrick White, Nobel Prize winner, used it to demolish Australia's complacency, creating what he called an antidote to the country's dun-colored realism. His Gothic was psychological and merciless. Peter Carey brought it into the 19th century with a science fiction edge and pitch black humor. I have an Aussie friend and he has a very dark humor. Would like to ask my Aussie followers if that's an Aussie thing. It's just like dark humor. It's your kind of thing because it's my kind of thing. Maybe that's why we're friends. And Joan Lindsay's Picnic at Hanging Rock. A group of schoolgirls vanishing into the Australian landscape on Valentine's Day, 1900. Became one of the most haunting images in the Gothic tradition anywhere in the world. A landscape that swallows people whole, that offers no explanation, no closure, no remains. Is there anything more Gothic than that? So, to my Australian in the comments who asked, is there Gothic? Yes. You have your Gothic. You have always had your Gothic. And it's one of the most complex, most honest, most genuinely unsettling Gothic traditions in the world. Precisely because it was forged not from fantasy but from real darkness, from exile, from the uncanny landscape, from the horror of what colonialism actually did. The resistance of those who refused to let that horror be erased. Just like in Tropical Gothic. That is what I love about Tropical Gothic as framework and Australian Gothic as its cousin. Both emerge from landscapes that were made into nightmares by colonial imagination, and both fight back. We have that in common. If you want to keep exploring Gothic traditions from unexpected places, places that canon forgot or deliberately overlooked, this is exactly what we do here at Halls in the Forest by Kate Butter Books, host by me. Subscribe, follow, and leave me a comment. Tell me where you're from and what does your Gothic fiction